No mai, haere mai, kia ora, and welcome to Shine Today. My guest on the program is a global expert on the topic of free speech. Jacob Mchangama is a Danish lawyer. He is also a human rights advocate and a social commentator. He's the founder and director of Justitia, which is a Copenhagen-based think tank focusing on human rights, freedom of speech, and the rule of law. He is the host of free speech podcast Clear and Present Danger and has literally written the book on free speech, a history from Socrates to social media. Jacob, a pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Firstly, you talk in your book about free speech atrophy. What do you mean by that term?
Yeah, free speech entropy is sort of the tendency where once free speech has been established, then it tends to erode over time. Whether it's because people take it for granted, whether because those in power find it inconvenient. So it's a very difficult and delicate principle that has to be sustained by every generation that benefits from it.
Is this a cyclical process? Do you think that that every generation there's we start with free speech, and then once people get into power, they prevent this free speech of others that may be opposed to them?
Well, we certainly don't start with free speech, because for most of human history, free speech has not been the norm, and there have, free speech originated in the Athenian democracy some 2,500 years ago, but it was not sort of a straight process from there. There's very long times where free speech was not in ascendancy, but I think in mature democracies like New Zealand, maybe especially younger generations, perhaps tend to take free speech for granted. Yeah. The fact that you and I can sit here and have a discussion on politics, religion, that is something that could not be done in a lot of other countries, but we don't necessarily think of it as exercising free speech. This is just, we doing our job.
Is it cyclical? And if so, where are we in the cycle, in your opinion?
Yeah, I don't think there's sort of an iron law that can describe it, but I think we are in a global free speech recession, if you like. So things are certainly better than 100 or 200 years ago, but I think that in the 1990s and when the internet emerged, we thought, well, free speech and democracy are going to be global norms that will sort of do away with authoritarianism.
I mean, people certainly would see this as, well, in some ways, the golden age of communication, social media, internet. Everybody has the world as their stage in some ways.
Sure, but I think there are a couple of things that blurs the picture. So authoritarian states, for instance, have reverse engineered the technology that gave so much promise to do high-tech censorship and surveillance. But also democracies have become much more, there's what I call elite panic about free speech, seeing free speech sometimes as much as a threat as the basis of democracy. And so you see an increasing number, especially in Europe, of democratic states trying to control, put some top-down control, for instance, of social media that is likely to have consequences for free speech.
We've seen the impact of social media with the influence that has on politics and with the Arab Spring of a few years back. Do you think, in general terms, social media has had a positive influence on free speech?
I do. Though, I think especially since 2016, I think the US presidential election was really a turning point in institutional attitudes towards free speech. The narrative quickly emerged that it was sort of Russian disinformation that had decided the election. I don't think the empirical data backs up that claim, but it was certainly, it helped polarize and amplify voices that were sometimes extreme and spreading polarizing information.
I mean, some people would see perhaps these tools of free speech that can also be used for propagating views that may be seen as dangerous to society.
But this is not something that is, of course, unique to the internet. So, if you were at the Catholic Church and the printing press comes and Martin Luther uses it to great effect, you naturally are very skeptical about the benefits of the printing press. When radio, the telegraph, all these communications technology disrupts the public sphere, and what tends to happen is that those who are the institutional gatekeepers find their authority eroded, and they're afraid of the consequences of basically allowing the unwashed mob into the public sphere.
There is concern at the moment that perhaps those who have significant power of influence are using that power in terms of free speech to marginalise and perhaps even victimise minority groups within our society to marginalise their influence. Do you see that to be the case?
Well, it's certainly true that free speech, if you have robust protections of free speech, as I believe you do in New Zealand, that does allow extremists, including white supremacists and others, to voice their views and amplify it. That is true. But on the other hand, I think we have to look at it historically. Is free speech an ally or an enemy of marginalized, persecuted groups? And I think overwhelmingly history shows that the values of free speech and equality are mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive. So if you were a racial minority, if you were women who are disenfranchised, you depended on free speech to petition the government, to argue in public for your rights. And those who wanted to suppress religious, racial minorities have always used censorship and repression as a tool to do that. So I think in many ways free speech is the most powerful engine of equality that human beings have ever stumbled upon.
Of course, it's always a balance. Our individual freedoms should in no way impose on the freedoms and opportunities of other people as well. Sometimes perhaps free speech can do that, do you think?
Well, there are limits. For instance, I believe that people should be allowed to say hateful things about groups, but should you be allowed to go outside a mosque or a church or synagogue in front of a rowdy crowd and say, let's go get the Christians or let's go get the Jews or the Muslims? That's where I would draw the limit, because you're inciting to violence. There are other limits, narrow cases of defamation. If I were to publicly accuse you of some vile crime, it would be fair for you to say, well, prove your case, Jacob, or otherwise face consequences in the legal system.
Because there is a line, as much as we'd like to say that free speech should be an absolute, everybody, I suppose, has a line, that if you're on the right side of that line, you should have the right of free speech. But if you're on the wrong side of the line, then you perhaps shouldn't have that opportunity. Different people have different lines in different places, right?
And that's why I really strongly believe it's crucial to have a very principled approach to free speech, because we're all different in the sense of, what do we find offensive? And all of us have this bias that the ideas that we cherish, we feel are especially deserving of protection, and therefore we're much more likely to say free speech for me, but not for thee. And that doesn't really work in complex, diverse societies, because then if you have progressives in power, they might say, well, we find certain religious views to be offensive to our values, and vice versa. Whereas, if people with different religious beliefs or secular beliefs are to be able to live together in peace, even be neighbors, colleagues, friends, spouses, we need to be able to settle our differences in peace rather than resorting to violence.
Where's the line for you personally?
Well, like I said, incitement to violence is a pretty bright line. It's a pretty bright line for me. But then you can look at other things that involve speech, like fraud involves speech, and no one would say that fraud should be allowed on the basis of free speech grounds. So
you would go as far to say that in some circumstances censorship is actually important to protect society from extremist ideology or propaganda? What's your thought?
Well, censorship, it depends on whether you mean sort of pre-publication censorship. I'm certainly not in favor of, but I think it is right and proper that if let's use the example that I said, I stand outside a church or a synagogue or a mosque calling for violence, then the police should absolutely protect those I'm inciting against, and they should arrest me, and I should be put on trial and convicted for trying to incite violence against other people. And if I use my speech to try and defraud someone, I should be punished for that. And again, if I were to accuse you of a very serious crime in public and it was just basically invented, then I should also face the consequences.
There's laws in place for a reason, right?
Yeah. But that what I'm particularly concerned about preserving is the ability to voice different viewpoints. So I'm very much wedded to the idea of viewpoint neutrality, that the government should not take sides on various debates.
And it's so often that those who are in power, who have everything to lose, they're the ones that are deciding where the line should be, right? Yeah. Some may also feel that social media, particularly in recent years, has almost been weaponized free speech, that it's being used to cause divisions and factions within our society, which honestly is ripping us apart, not just in terms of individual countries, but as the human race. Would you agree with that?
I think that to a certain extent, social media can amplify that. I think the underlying problem with polarization predates social media. So the best case is United States, for instance. Declining trust in institutions and traditional media, sort of polarization, political polarization, political tribalism that predates social media. But social media can help amplify it, and I think also the internet has developed from being this sort of radically egalitarian, decentralized space to a much more platformized, centralized space with some perverse incentives of sort of gathering up more and more data, targeted ads, and so on that can fuel this process more. So I think that we're still sort of in the very initial phase of the digital age. So in the same way that it took a very long time for print to develop sort of serious quality journalism, it will take some time before we adjust our institutions, our mindset to the digital age, and that's a process we're going through. But I still think we're already seeing great improvements in the ability of open source intelligence journalists, for instance, to document and debunk Russian propaganda and war crimes and so on. I think people generally are much less gullible than some of the most concerned politicians.
Depends on which social media sites you go to, I suppose. And I mean, we've recently had a global pandemic. Everybody had a lot more time to watch endless YouTube videos.
And you can find, you can certainly find, I don't know what the the percentage of people who got vaccinated in New Zealand. In Denmark, it was very, very high.
97% plus. Yeah.
So of course, you can find loud voices, and if you focus incessantly on those who spread conspiracy theories, you might say it's very dangerous. But the fact that so many people got vaccinated also suggests that there's more than a critical mass who actually believe in the science and who see the benefits of getting it.
In those circumstances, there were some people that were very vocal against vaccination, and I mean the science wasn't on their side, but they had a bit of momentum.
Yeah.
Is that a circumstance where it's perhaps appropriate to limit free speech when what is, provably false information is being propagated and it may put the lives of vulnerable individuals on the line?
I think it's extremely difficult. Science is, in many ways, science, no one holds the final truth, right? Yep. And I think that, if you look at the recommendations by various health organizations, at a certain point they said, face masks are not likely to protect you, and then they changed their minds. And that's not because Bill Gates propagated a global conspiracy. It's just because, you find out, the science leads you in different directions. What you once thought was the most likely correct description of science may change, especially when you're just at the beginning of a pandemic that you haven't encountered. So if you sort of say, okay, we're a month into the pandemic, this is the truth, and we'll legislate that, well, then you'll be standing with egg on your face when you have to change that as your understanding grows better, and you're likely to erode trust, because if you come out saying this is the truth about the pandemic and then change that, then people are going to say, hold on, you're trying to be a ministry of truth, and what you said yesterday is no longer applies.
This is, of course, a live issue about whether or not the truth, whatever that is, needs to be defended. And claims from both sides of an argument about, this or that is fake news, and the various conspiracy theory rabbit holes. Do you think truth needs to be defended?
Of course it does, but at the same time, no one can have a definition of the truth, like legally set in stone. But I still, even if social media allows misinformation and disinformation to be spread, I still think free speech and access to information is crucial in determining the truth and coming as close to it as we can. There will always be those who cannot be reached, who are being radicalized, and that again, this was also true before the age of social media. Conspiracy theories was not invented with the internet. But as long as you have a critical mass of people, and here I take great solace from my own children. For instance, my daughter who's 10. sometimes says things that are not necessarily in accordance with the truth. And my son, who's 13, will say, "Oh, that's just a TikTok fact," and that suggests to me, that they've actually understood perhaps better than older generations that you can't just take anything that you find online for granted.
I mean, I suppose the relativism of truth. This is my truth. This is your truth. That becomes a dangerous, I suppose, space for having conversations about real things. If each is doing what seems right in their own eyes according to their own truth, how can we actually have civil conversations about what's important to us as a society?
First of all, of course, education is important. Having institutions that grounds us in certain basic commonalities, because we do need social cohesion in societies. But imagine if someone was to say, what is the capital T truth in religion? I think many of you viewers
That's the history of the last few thousand years.
And that that would be quite uncomfortable. Who is it the Lutherans or the Calvinists who gets to police and define the truth? So I think actually we can have vibrant societies where we don't necessarily agree on everything, but very often it's also, how do you separate opinion from fact? There's a gray zone in there, but you must build, of course, robust institution, credible media, and communicate. Government institutions must also communicate in a way that...
Difficult for respected academics to compete with TikTok facts, though.
Well, for a certain part of the population, probably. And again, that's why we also need to update our institutions to make them more credible and more engaging with the world that we live in. And that's a process that's likely to be messy, but is necessary.
Recently, of course, Elon Musk, the current richest man in the world, bought Twitter.
Yeah.
He also describes himself as a free speech champion. The richest man in the world owning a platform where millions of people communicate their truth. Is that good news or bad news for free speech, do you think?
It really depends on the fallout, or where does it land. I would say inherently I'm not in favor of sort of wealthy businessmen owning sort of centralized platforms for communication. I think is Elon Musk going to value Twitter more than Tesla if China puts pressure on him, say we don't like what's being spread about us on Twitter? Is he likely to compromise that? Also, it just seems to me that he communicates in a very erratic manner and is uncertain perhaps about what it takes to run successfully a social media platform.
And perhaps more of an Elon Musk champion than a free speech champion, perhaps.
Yeah. But of course, we should also allow him some time to find a model. But right now, I don't think it necessarily looks particularly promising. But then again, if I was put in charge of one of the big social media platforms, I would also struggle in finding the right model. That's why I actually think that the future of free speech should depend more on decentralized models. You're a privately owned network. You're an alternative to the government broadcaster, government-funded broadcaster. I think that's a good thing. You have different perspectives.
In many parts of the world, including here in New Zealand, there are moves to introduce what is broadly referred to as hate speech legislation. There's also a lot of concern about the dangers of this type of legislation. What's your view on that, Jacob?
Yeah, so I've actually it's been a privilege for me to learn more about current hate speech legislation from legal experts here in New Zealand. And if I've understood it correctly, there've only been sort of a couple of cases maybe where people have been prosecuted or convicted. So that's, and even though you have very similar laws to the UK, where these laws are being used much more aggressively to police speech. So that suggests to me that you have a vibrant culture of free speech in New Zealand. At the same time, you have also what seems to me at least, a harmonious, diverse, multiracial society, even though I'm sure there are conflicts, as is inevitable, and you have a checkered past and these things. But that suggests to me that, it's a good example that free speech and equality can go hand in hand.
Let's have honest conversations with people we disagree with,
and
still respect them,
and
right?
also that civil society can shun those who are extremist, and that I think is a much better antidote to hatred than having the government trying to police this in manners that where hate speech laws will inherently be vague, and they are also likely to capture, and it will benefit particular civil society groups who have a cozy relationship perhaps with the government.
Whoever happens to be in charge. Yeah. Some would see free speech and hate speech legislation to be almost at opposite ends of the spectrum, that hate speech is a form of censorship. It shuts down some voices in our society. Again, back to what we were talking about beforehand, sometimes these protections are important, but who gets to decide who's in and who's out?
Yeah, no, I'm very much opposed to hate speech laws. I understand the impulse, and I'm willing to concede that many advocates of hate speech laws are well-intentioned. It's not that they want to sort of introduce a society in 1984 Orwellian society.
Yeah.
They genuinely believe that there's a need to police certain forms of speech in order to protect minorities and
very difficult to define the terms here. I suppose what is hate speech?
What is hate
who
speech?
gets to decide who that is, and
what are the
whether or not somebody's offended?
Yeah, and what are the unintended consequences? So one of the examples I use in my book is the Weimar Republic in Germany that collapsed and the Nazis took over. And there you actually had laws that the failing democracy tried to enforce, including targeting Nazis. And ultimately, these laws that were supposed to protect democracy were used by the Nazis to abolish democracy, including abolishing free speech. So that, to me, is a powerful example of what I call the Weimar fallacy, this idea that militant democracy has to ban extreme forms of speech might rest on very shaky empirical ground.
Is there a place, though, for legislation to be used to protect vulnerable minorities from exploitation in society?
Sure. I think it's perfectly in order to have discrimination laws, for instance, and also extended into the private sphere. If you had a nightclub, and that nightclub or a restaurant, and that was to say, oh, you can't enter here if you're Jewish or if you're black, then I'm very much in favor of of having laws that prohibit that. And I also the Christchurch massacre is obviously a very traumatic event for this society, and of course, police and security services should be particularly attentive to future threats against the Muslim community and protect mosques. So definitely.
Let's talk about the connection, I suppose, between freedom of speech and freedom of conscience, or freedom of religion specifically.
Yeah.
In some ways, these are different sides of the same coin, or?
Yeah, I think I think freedom of conscience really becomes essential. The Reformation is, of course, a huge flashpoint for that, and I think Martin Luther really kicks it off by using the printing press to great effect. And when he's summoned before the emperor at the Diet of Worms, he stands. He doesn't actually say, "Here I stand, like I do no other," but he basically says that I won't bow before the emperor or the pope. Show me where in scripture I'm mistaken, otherwise I won't back down. And that, I think, is a powerful watershed moment for freedom of conscience in Europe. But at the same time, we shouldn't mistake Luther for being someone who's principled in favor of freedom of conscience. He was perfectly happy to persecute people because I think Martin Luther basically thought that he had found the truth and the Catholic Church had corrupted the truth, and he said everyone should have access to the Bible because they will find the truth as I see it. And that, I think, unleashed a number of unintended consequences, because if you read the Bible, it's not guaranteed that you come to the same conclusion as Martin Luther.
You end up with each doing what seems right in their own eyes, and
suddenly you have an alphabet soup of various Protestant sects, and that is a self-reinforcing effect that pushes us towards wider degree of freedom of conscience and ultimately freedom of expression. Even though, of course, there's a fierce backlash. And initially, there's a period where everyone tries to persecute each other, but ultimately, it's not. You cannot have societies where you try to exterminate the others because of wrong belief.
I mean, there have been so many historical and even current examples of religion being used to repress expression of people who have different views, of course. But for people of faith here in New Zealand, how can we best champion the principles of free speech, even with those that we perhaps ideologically disagree with?
Well, I think something like today is a good example of it. You know, you invite me on. I'm not a religious believer. In the book I've written and in my podcast there are many episodes where I'm very critical of and document sort of crimes against free speech and freedom of conscience that have been committed by religious authorities. And we can have a discussion about that. And I think if people who are religious believers acknowledge the things that have been committed in their name or in their religion's name and say, this is something that we distance ourselves from. We still have belief in religious doctrines, but we acknowledge that we can't impose the truth on others, and that in fact our right to live in accordance with our conscience, to practice our faith publicly, depends on providing the same right to others, whether religious believers or non-believers.
If we're telling to people what to think and what to say and what not to say, we become part of the problem.
Exactly. You're basically setting yourself up for being the target rather than the beneficiary of freedom of conscience and free speech or laws restricting it.
Jacob, we started this conversation talking about how free speech is perhaps in decline globally. Do you think that's reversible?
Yes, I think so. I think you're likely to see that some of the initiatives being enacted by democracies will have consequences. It will affect some people and groups that may be sympathetic to limiting free speech. They will see, wow, this is overreach, and we need to do something about it. I also think that the role of China and the sort of the extreme censorship there might, in the same way during the Cold War, free speech was seen as sort of a value that united democracies against communism. We might see the same. It'll be sort of create some kind degree of social cohesion among democracies. We don't want to be that. But ultimately, I think it depends on a culture of free speech that has to be sustained by each of one of us. And I hope my book can be a small contribution to that.
Certainly a very helpful conversation started on a very important topic. Jacob, thank you so much for the work that you do. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.